In this module, we will be talking about Haydn's Opus 33 number 1 quartet in B minor, and we will be focusing on the first movement, which is in sonata form. The first movement of this quartet number 1 exhibits a lot of the features of what make this series of quartets exemplars of the classical form and of this series of quartets in general. Composed between 1762 and 1765, the Opus 1 and 2 quartets, we're not including the Opus 3 again, were based on quartet patterns that were already circulating around at the time, so Haydn based it very much on what he was hearing around him. By Opus 20, mature Haydn style is coming through, and we're getting more Haydn and less of the contemporary patterns that were around. But it's really with the Opus 33 quartets that Haydn becomes the father of the string quartet as we know it now. The quartets have a lot of the features that are the high point of the classical period. In 1781, the Opus 3 quartets are created, and they represent the full classical style. They stand out as the example of the classical style throughout Europe, and that's the reason that we are choosing the Opus 33 quartets as exemplars of Haydn's style in quartet writing. The success of these quartets can also be attributed to the widespread printing and circulation that was going on at the time, as well as the well-received approving criticism and the esteem by other composers and musicians that Haydn's works were receiving. Haydn called these quartets brand new works written in a new and special way, and said that he hadn't composed any quartets for 10 years, which was a bit of a stretch since it had been about 9 years. The Opus 33 have weightier developments. Previously, the developments and expositions were roughly of equal length. In this movement, however, the development itself is a little bit on the smaller side, but there are development sections within the exposition and the recapitulation that lend to the weightiness of the development. The blending of themes and transformations, accompaniment and melody swap places, so it becomes hard to tell where the phrase begins. The transitions are integrated rather than delineated. Another feature of the quartet that makes it different from the quartets that came before it is the equal relationship of instruments, the voices, and those voices in conversation, as opposed to the galant style, which is again more soloist versus accompaniment. And we do have instances of that in this quartet too. It is transitioning to more equal voices. The slow movements in this quartet, in this entire quartet, not just this first movement, the slow movements are a chance for Haydn to represent different musical forms. So he does that throughout the Opus 33 quartets, and also uses them as an aria opportunity for the first violin, who was violinist Tomasini that he worked with and was fond of at the time. And this is also relating to the popularity, again, of the Italian opera coming out of the Baroque tradition, and also out of Haydn's own writing a lot of opera for the Esterházy Opera House. Another important feature of the Opus 33 quartets are the scherzo movements. Very famously, this is the only cycle of the quartets that have these scherzo movements. and the scherzo movements, they mimic minuet trio movements, but the trio isn't delineated clearly. So the scherzo movement will have a middle section, but Haydn can play with it a lot more and can play with the expectation of a trio section, and make even more of a musical joke out of it. But it seemed to be that also other composers didn't pick this up, including Haydn, who was very inspired by these quartets. And one gets the feeling that in retelling a joke too much, it could perhaps get tired. So the scherzo movements begin and end with the opus 33 quartets. Another thing that is of note is that the numbering of the quartets were not done by Haydn per se, that there were different orderings that were being published at the time, and the real order is ambiguous to us now. This quartet is placed first as the B minor quartet. It's the only minor quartet of the 6, and I feel that it's placed there because Haydn is coming out of his Sturm und Drang period, and this quartet is the closest to that period in style with the minor keys. In the first movement, there's no real unit that can be called a motive here. We have the blending of units and lines. And we see in this first musical example that the melody goes across the different instruments, and you see in measure 1, in example 1, measure 38, the second violin gets the melody for a bar, and then we see it in the very next measure going up to the first violin. In the first 10 bars, this material that shows up in the first bar in the first violin is brought across, and it's used so much that it's difficult to get an identifiable theme out of it, and it's used basically 10 times within the 10 bars, but it appears in 8 bars, and it's only in measure 5 and 9 that we don't have the figure, although the cello makes up for it by having it twice in measure 3 and measure 7. In measure 18, we see that material, but the accompanying voices are quite different. And we see the sustained notes and the long whole note in the cello and the half notes in the inner voices. And then that material gets brought into the cello. That material gets brought into the second violin, and we can see that it's almost the same, but Haydn starts to play with it, and he's adding a 16th note before the 16th note run, making the first quarter into a dotted rhythm, and then that dotted rhythm, which is already a blurring of the lines, ends up becoming new material, which forms the end of the exposition, measure 28 to 30. Because the framework of the sonata is blended, the sections are a little bit vague, and so it's useful to work backwards to see the recapitulation in order to determine the exposition and the recapitulation by having them mirror each other. And so on this page we have each of those 3. We've got the exposition, beginning of that, and then where the development picks up, which is basically the double bar, so that's easy to see, and then where the recapitulation begins. One of the reasons that the sections are vague is because there's many development that's happening both within the exposition and in the recap. Then this also, as we were saying earlier, gives a little bit more weight to the feeling of the development, which is why we're counting that as a weightier development, even though the actual number of bars is shorter in this particular movement. The exposition has a mini development, measures 18 to 27, and you can see that that first motivic figure is being passed around the voices. And then in the recapitulation, you've got another mini development, and he passes another, instead of that first material we were looking at earlier, now we have a 16th, 32nd dotted bit of material that is passing throughout the different voices. The connection point is also blurred. he blurs the line between where the exposition ends and the recapitulation ends in that section. In measure 17, that it ends with a fermata. That bar gets cut out in the recapitulation, so it ends one bar shorter. And after their respective developments, the recapitulation rejoins the exposition in their mirrored parts in measure 82 and measure 28. And the new key is now B minor in the recap as opposed to the D major from the exposition. There are examples of the galant style in this that Haydn is coming out of. He has it in the middle, but it is really very much in the new equal voice quartet style, although it doesn't go quite as far in that direction as his later quartets. We can see the galant style in measure 44 to 48, where the first violin has lots of runs and the other voices are obviously accompanying in eighth notes without much movement. And then we've got melody trading going across in the second example, where you see the first violin having it the second violin, and then it's carried across the two inner voices in the third bar. And that's a small excerpt that continues for another 19 measures after that. In the bottom example, we see another way in which the voices are given equal weight. They're playing in unison as though all the instruments are of equal importance, with stretto entrances as well as with coming in on chords together vertically. Another feature that is important to note is in the first movement we see a lot of sudden dynamic contrasts between fortes and pianos, and we can see that this is a key feature that probably influenced Beethoven most greatly, since Beethoven is known for that as being characteristic of his quartet music, the sudden dynamic changes. So we can see in this quartet how much it influenced Mozart and Beethoven by the traces of the quartet that remained with them in their own writings of their quartets.